Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel on a very moochy and cold winter's morning, let me tell you. Now, if you're new here, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without the help of grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers or equipment, really just me and them struggling along together either inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your bag, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. Hit the alert bell. I am an amateur, but my ramblings might help you in your orchid journey. And the subject of today's video is perhaps less than dramatic. It's this charming little beast, which is called Gomessa radicans. And if you like small / miniature orchids and fragrant orchids, then this is for you. If you like big, flashy, amazing flowers, this is not for you. Because as you can see, they are tiny. Now, firstly, this used to be known as Ornithophora radicans, and then it was moved into the Gomessa group. So it was kind of on its own, in its own little genus, just happily doing its thing. But anyway, now it's in a bigger family. But let's talk about, I love a bit of naming, Gomessa. So the name Gomessa comes from an amazing Portuguese scientist, botanist, doctor in the late 18th, early 19th century called Bernardino Antonio Gomes. And he spent quite a bit of time in Brazil, which then was a colony of Portugal, where this little baby is a native. But in fact, it was a Scotsman called Robert Brown that gave this group of plants the name Gomessa after the Portuguese doctor. And he, interesting fellow, he was sort of auspiced by Sir Joseph Banks and went on many an expedition around the world, including Australia, where he named many, many plants actually. And he spent a lot of time in South America too. And he named this group of orchids after our illustrious Portuguese doctor, who in fact is the father of Portuguese dermatology. There you go. And he founded the Lisbon Botanic Gardens, and there's a bust to him in the Lisbon Botanic Gardens to this day. So there you go. An interesting and famous origin of that name, Gomessa. Now, radicans is an interesting sort of Latin suffix which you find in many, many plants, not just in orchids, and it really means grows along the ground and can root. So really anything that lollops and then can send down roots. So perhaps you can see here, you see that lolloping habit of this plant, and then these aerial roots, well, not really aerial roots, but roots along the stem of the plant, so it can actually spread itself a bit sort of, like many other orchids, like a Miltonia, for example, will do the same thing, sort of on the surface. Its rhizome is much bigger. Well, in fact, which brings us to an interesting point. This one, Gomessa radicans, is called a small or miniature orchid. It's not that small, but the flowers are tiny. We'll get to that. But in terms of its shape and size, it's not massive, and it's yet to fill this pot, and I can't wait for it to do so. So although it does have that radicans creeping habit where it can root, unlike, say, a Miltonia, which is a much bigger scale plant, which is really difficult to pot and manage because of that lolloping habit, this isn't. It's going to take a bit of time to fill this pot, and then I'll worry about it then. So our little friend here, Gomessa radicans, comes from the eastern coast of, well, there's only one coast of Brazil anyway, the east coast of Brazil. On that, it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Environment. It's the Atlantic forest on that east coast, which is very endangered, unfortunately, not much of it left. And this plant comes from that area. It's one of those amazing biodiversity hotspots in the world, lots of endemic plants and animals there. And this plant doesn't grow to a high altitude, and it's much more along the coast, which is very moist all year because it gets all this onshore mist and rain from the ocean. But it's comparatively warm, but moist all the time. The further inland you go in that same sort of biosphere, can get dry winters, whereas this one tends not to. Which leads us to an interesting point. That this is described as a warm grower, and not being to high altitude and being on the coast of Brazil, you think, that ain't going to take the chill too well. Ta-da, Exhibit A, I grow this outside all year. And the reason, plant lovers, I'm confident to do that is because I actually bought this at an orchid show. And actually, it was an orchid and bonsai show. And I don't love bonsai, just saying. But it was with the Vietnamese community on the northwest part of Melbourne, and about every month actually they have an orchid and bonsai show, and then every so often a sort of a bigger one with plant sales. And yes, the great thing is that it's the growers who are selling, and there was lots of orchids. And I saw this and thought, why not? Because I was able to talk to the grower, and she actually lives a bit further out than me and does get really colder winter nighttime minimums. So here in the city, our winter nighttime minimums won't drop to maybe 3 to 4 degrees centigrade would be the coolest. So, you know, the high 30s Fahrenheit. However, the last few days actually it's got down to 1. It was damn cold, let me tell you. Anyway, where she is, she will get to sort of -2, -3 centigrade. So, you know, the 30s, 30 Fahrenheit. So cold and below freezing. But no frost, but still she grows it undercover. So I thought, well, look, if she can make it thrive and hers was a beautiful specimen, then I can. So I bought it. And you know what? Bless it, it's a curiosity, I think, rather than a passion plant, unless you're into miniature small plants or fragrant orchids. So the curious thing is then, it can certainly take cold temperatures, which you might not have thought from just doing basic research about this plant. So if you're in a similar climate to mine, you'll be able to grow it outside undercover all year with no problem. And although it does come from that moist area and doesn't necessarily have a winter dry spell, I always tend to water things a lot less in winter, even the ones outside that need to be kept moist all year. Even so, I just don't water them that often, maybe once a week. It really depends on how dry the pot gets, because obviously the ambient temperature isn't very high. It's still bright and sunny, hopefully, on most winter days, but the pots don't dry out so quickly. So by default, you're kind of giving it a bit of a drier cycle than it would have in the warmer summer periods. But I still water it. So let's talk about its form. So as you can see, very grass-like leaves, first of all. Doesn't look like an orchid at all, does it? Which is kind of interesting, because if your collection is all large, strappy plants, or the much more succulent leaves of like cattleyas, then this is just an interesting contrast, and it will just form a dome of grass and then get covered in these sprays of delicious little flowers, which we'll get to. So just from its foliage alone, it's kind of an interesting, different plant. But you can perhaps see that ultimately, its form is not dissimilar to, say, the growth pattern of a Miltonia or an Oncidium. So it has a pseudobulb, 2 leaves, and the flower spike, which I'll try and show you, comes out of the junction of the new leaf and the pseudobulb on a new growth, so the end growth. It's quite vigorous, as you can see, so you've got lots of different growth points, meaning, as with this one, lots and lots and lots of flower spikes. Now, many of them haven't come out yet, but a lot of them have, although you perhaps can't see them. So, an epiphyte, and as you can see, I've got it in a pre-drilled pot, and my medium is medium bark with a little bit of sphagnum moss in there just to keep the moisture levels up. I feel though, you know, there are epiphytes and epiphytes and epiphytes, and I recently made a video about a dendrobium that I saw growing wild in Bali, and that is a real clinger just growing into the fissures of the bark and moss on the tree. This one I feel is going to grow more in a nook with more matter. So I think it's going to want a little bit more substance. So it probably grows at slightly lower levels, you know, perhaps at the base of the tree or not that high up, and certainly in areas where a bit of material has collected. I feel, I haven't seen a picture of it in the wild, can't attest to that truth. That's my feeling, plant lovers. It also is quite a shade lover as well, and those forests are sort of partly deciduous and partly evergreen, so it will get a little bit more light in winter, which is something to bear in mind as well. But it is more of a low light plant, which would suggest it's sort of lower down in the whole canopy of growth, suggesting too that it's going to get more material for it to get its roots in. Now, although we just talked about the coal, it can deal with the heat too, because obviously where it comes from, a lot warmer, can rain in summer here. We're not classically Mediterranean, but it's nonetheless a hot-ish summer climate. And this, I just water it, I water everything more often in summer, sails through the summer period. It's quite a tangly plant. It looks actually as though there were kind of 2 major growth sort of plantlets to start with, but it's really spread a lot. Obviously it's growing towards the light because I haven't got the perfect conditions yet, but I'm hoping it's going to fill this pot, and it will be a fantastic grassy specimen covered in flowers. And let's talk about those then, plant lovers. I think they look a bit insiclia like the flowers, although they're so tiny. I'll try and get some good close-ups for you. I might just drop in some stills if I can't get good live action footage. It's hard to focus on them, but they're very, 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 very pale, almost translucent white, delicious, and this amazing light, sweet honey fragrance. Now, obviously, given the size of it, you've got to get your nose in, but it's a really lovely, fresh, light fragrance. So if fragrant orchids are your thing, this is the orchid for you too. So as you can see, it produces its spike from the junction of the pseudobulb and the leaf, as I said, and each spike has got, I think this has got about 15 flowers, so quite proliferous. And it got stems just about everywhere actually. So sort of every growth point can essentially have a flower spike for you. And it can flower from sort of late summer all the way through. So mine, I think, has had a flush of flowers before. But anyway, this is sort of the season. I would say very late summer, autumn into early winter. And a delicious little thing it is. And such a surprise, because I have to say, it's so easy to grow. I don't really give much attention to it. Apart from feeding, let's get to that. So with fertilizer, generally what I do with most of my orchids is slow release fertilizer pellets in the mix when I repot. Then a topical application of slow release fertilizer in spring, the same stuff usually, not a huge amount, keep them keen. And then throughout the growing warmer period, I give it an application of liquid fertilizer like everything else. So that can be an orchid specific liquid fertilizer, or just a flowering plant fertilizer, or just a general liquid fertilizer. Always dial that down to sort of 1/8, 1/10 for the recommended dose. Again, don't overfeed them. And then in between that, I will give it a tonic. That's something perhaps seaweed based, or a worm juice concoction from a worm farm. So that's the juice that's the runoff from a worm farm, and you dilute that with water. But it's fantastically full of biological goodness, great for plants as a general tonic. So those things I give throughout the warmer growing season. And although it's got very grassy leaves, and having it outside all the time, some orchids just really attract munching insects outside, but this one doesn't. Nothing seems to have a go at it. So remarkably pest-free being outside. Now, it would make a great potted specimen inside as well, I'm sure. It would just need indirect light. And I think it might just like slightly cooler temperatures in winter, not cold, but cooler. So in fact, it would be great inside, and perhaps against a window, a shaded window, so it gets a little bit of cold from the glass in winter. But I would think very, very easy to grow inside all the time if you are too cold outside during winter for it to be able to thrive. But if you're sort of only a little bit cooler than me, then it would, I think, survive quite well in an unheated greenhouse. So as I said, this lady who grew it further out from me does get considerably colder winters than mine, and hers is only sheltered overhead, not from the side. So still getting cold. So I reckon an unheated greenhouse in warmer parts of Britain, for example, you'd certainly be able to grow this. So there we are, plant lovers. Gomessa radicans, a charming little miniature orchid, although I don't think it's that small. I do think the flowers are minute, but the orchid itself isn't. But it's a sweetheart, and it's not difficult to grow. And as I said, just from a foliage perspective, it will make a nice contrast to other orchids in your collection if you've got the right climate and conditions to grow it, which hopefully you have. Well, there we are, plant lovers. Who knows what I'll be doing next week? You'll have to hit subscribe and the notification bell to know exactly when my video lands in your inbox. But until that point, I hope all's well with you, wherever you are, and I look very much forward to seeing you next Friday.